I'm a firm believer that there is no such thing as someone who is irredeemable, but I want to point this out. Take a good hard look at that line. Look what's in it. There's a murderer, there's an adulterer, there's a prostitute, but God has an frankly annoying habit sometimes of taking very flawed people and accomplishing amazing things. Look what they accomplish. Look what God accomplishes with them.
These characteristics that Joseph had, every one of us as husbands and fathers and just men in general should emulate. He was a good leader of his family. He was obedient. He was obedient to God. He was courageous. He was committed. He was a man of conviction. He had compassion. He was creative, and he was competent. All of these things are the attributes that men should aspire to. Can't think of a better example to highlight and put forward to people, especially at this time of year, than Joseph, a man that we know so little about but have so much to learn from.
The priest is standing there with Joseph, holding Jesus. Mary isn't standing in the women's court some distance away. When Joseph was asked, "What name do you give your son?" the answer that he gave was Jesus. And they looked at him and said, "There is no one in your family with this name. Are you sure that's the name?" And he says, "Yes, his name is Jesus." I bet my next paycheck that happened, because that's what would have happened in that culture. Families carry names. This one is out of line. Good morning and welcome back to Fire for Effect. This should be episode 23, and we are recording this on the morning of Thursday, December the 18th, 2025. For those of you who have seen me show up here and there along the way, my name's Taylor George, and I am joined today by Marcus Moyer and Big Jim McBride, who I'm sure you have seen here and there along the way. They have finally twisted my arm hard enough to host one of these. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. If you heard one of the episodes a couple weeks ago, I am the odd man out in this group. I am the lone Roman Catholic, but that's okay. I don't mind. Today we're going to talk about, being close to Christmas. We're going to talk about somebody that I personally revere pretty strongly because of what he did. I think what he did was one of the most amazing things that any man's ever been called upon in this world to do. And that is Joseph. And you'll pardon me if I occasionally slip up and say Saint Joseph. That's just kind of a habit. But nonetheless, Joseph, of course, as we all know, was Jesus's foster father. And really, in my mind, if I've seen a man that had a tougher job and pulled it off more perfectly, I have no idea who it was. So with that, anything you gentlemen want to say before we get started?
Yeah, just that you we had a text string going between the group of us about I think it was last year when you first were kind of telling us this perspective of the story. And I was just kind of blown away at the detail you had about Joseph, who is a seemingly a small character in the Bible, but you pulled out some threads of detail that were really enlightening. And it's an aspect of the story that is very easily brushed over year to year. So I've been looking forward. And I've been asking you to repeatedly to be able to do this story before Christmas. So I'm so glad you decided to do it, and definitely looking forward to it. I think the audience is going to like it a lot.
More of a matter of time other than that, but appreciate it.
I also appreciate you bringing this topic to the table. And like Jim, I was blown away by the level of detail and the word is escaping, I guess, deductive reasoning that goes into this, because the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about Joseph, but there are certain things that must have been true about him in order for him to be called upon to do what he did. And in that role as a father, and of course, on multiple episodes, we've talked about the importance of a father in the home. And Joseph
Absolutely.
modeled that. And Jesus needed an earthly father as well. That relationship that he had with his, as you called him, Jesus's foster father, was a wonderful example of a father-son relationship. And there's just so much about it based on the scant verses we have in Scripture that refer to Joseph and tell us anything about it, about him. There's so much more to that story than you can gather and glean from just a surface level reading. There's some insinuation and some interpolation, I guess, that you have to apply to the story. But I don't think it's taking undue liberties with everything that we're getting ready to talk about this morning. I think it's all right in line. Had to have been true, or God would have never trusted him with this monumental task. And like you said, I don't know if anybody's ever been called on as a father to do anything harder.
Yeah. Tell me about
And
it.
so thanks again for bringing the topic. It's going to be really good. I think people are going to enjoy it.
Appreciate it. Well, gentlemen, one of the things I've said many times is that you can read the Bible and appreciate it for what it says, but you can see so much more if you understand the backdrop that it is written against, which is the Jewish culture. And sometimes there are things that are in there that, if you're not familiar with that culture, don't carry the meaning that they do once you see it. And so we're going to have a couple of those as we go through here today. So I like to start off with this. Who was Joseph? Well, the first and most important thing we know of is he was of the house of David. That's laid out very clearly in multiple different ways. My personal favorite is of course in Luke, where Luke lays out the genealogy. There's another version of that we see elsewhere, and they're not exactly identical, but they both get you the same place. And what I find really fascinating is there's two stops in that genealogy that are actually a lot that are worth talking about, but there's two I want to focus on today. One of them is that it goes obviously to David, the king, and we know that the Messiah was supposed to come from David's line. That was perfectly laid out. The other piece that I find really fascinating is, of course, if you take it all the way back, you read all the way to the end, and what you find is you finally reach Adam, and then the next line reads, and Adam's father was God. Okay? So there's two connections here. Right? So that's the first one. We know he's of the house of David. The second one is that we know that he was a skilled worker. Joseph, the word that is often used, and it comes out of King James, is carpenter. Now, honestly, in my opinion, that's a mistranslation. And the reason I say that is because the monk who made the translation way back in King James's day, he's sitting in England, where they build things out of wood because there's trees. And so his thought is, when he comes to the word which really translates builder, he looks out the window, he sees what's around him and concludes, aha, he's a carpenter. No. Much more likely he's a stonemason. That's what buildings were built out of in Nazareth. A few years ago, I saw I don't remember what TV channel it was on, doesn't matter, but it was of an archaeological expedition that was occurring in Nazareth. And they could tell by where they were in the ground that this is right about 1 AD, give or take. Okay, so it's in that 1 to 15, 20 year AD time frame. And what they said he said, if you look at these stones, just like what happened for centuries, you could see these marks that are the mason's mark that's showing he laid this particular stone. That's how he got paid. And what you realize is that we don't know whose mark is whose now, but the odds are pretty high that one of these is Joseph's. So he would have been a skilled worker. He also would have been an educated man. Now, why is that? Because in order to do his job, he had to understand mathematics. Because he had to know how these stones all go together, and that requires math. Which also means that he could read and write. Now, even in those days, most Jews could read enough to read the Torah. In fact, if you go to the Middle East today, you will find people that's all they know how to read is their holy book. But we know that this was more, again, because he had to be paid. He had to be able to use his mark and figure out how much he had laid and how much, therefore, he was entitled to be paid. That's math, that's writing, that's reading. So we know that he was an educated man. We also know he was a devout Jew. We know that he followed the law of Moses carefully and deliberately, because the story of Joseph is replete with times where he is performing tasks like going to the temple. We know he did these things. We know when he finds out that Mary's pregnant, we know that he again is consulting the laws, what he is to do. And that brings us to another point. We also know he was a compassionate man because he was unwilling to shame her. He was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to find a way out of this. And so what does that tell us? In my mind, that tells us that we've got somebody here who is smart, is capable, is the kind of man that we would recognize. Someone who is trying to do the right thing. To use a more modern word, he's a gentleman. And ultimately, it's going to be this guy who gives the 4 traits that would appear on the charge written by Pilate on top of the cross. This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And that's where I want to go here, is to delve into each of those pieces.
I can interject really quick, because I have the luxury
Absolutely.
of...
that's where I was finished.
Yeah. The luxury of Googling things while you're talking, and I wanted to look up the word you were talking about that refers to Joseph as a builder, and Google does corroborate what you're saying 100%. It says that it's from the Greek word, and I'll put it on the screen after editing. It's a Greek word, using English, using our language, spelled as Tekton. In Greek letters, it's a little bit different, but it means craftsman, artisan, or artisan, I guess, or builder, to your point. And and your, I guess, extrapolation of the context of when the Bible was written, King James Bible, etc. It's understandable how, like you said, they came up with the word carpenter. Matthew 13:55 says, "Is not this the carpenter's son?" referring to Joseph. And then Mark 6:3, "Is not this the carpenter?" referring to Jesus. but it does make sense that, yes, I'm sure they obviously used wood as well in Israel at that time, but they definitely used other materials like stones, things like that. So again, that's just an insight I never in a million years would have thought of until you brought it up. So just want to point that out.
So I was looking at that word as well. And as Taylor, being an attorney, knows, whoever gets to determine the meaning of words wins the argument every time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so
Words have meaning.
How these words are interpreted and translated, it really depends on what lexicon you're using, and how that person translates the word. And so I'm looking at Strong's Concordance, and there's a excellent app. If you guys don't use it, I would highly recommend it. It's called eSword, which basically takes all of these different tools that you can study the Bible with and puts them all together to include a concordance and translations, the Greek, the Hebrew, all of that. And the definition that I'm reading for that same word, Jim, that you mentioned, tektone, however that's pronounced, tectone, says this is from the base of the word that means an artificer as a producer of fabrics, that is specifically a craftsman in wood, carpenter. So I don't know. I wouldn't agree that it's a mistranslation. I think it's a different interpretation, maybe an understanding of the same word at different points in time. But Taylor's point is still valid, regardless of whether he was a carpenter of wood or a stonemason. All of those principles Taylor was describing are still accurate, still requires an education, still requires skill, still requires math, still requires good business sense to succeed in that. And he may have been both, an artificer in both wood and stone.
Possible.
I hadn't really thought of the absence of trees until I went to Israel myself, and that's a thing. May have been different back in Jesus' time, but where I guess it struck me the most was when I was in Nazareth and the Church of the Nativity. Have you gentlemen ever been there to Israel? So the Church of the Nativity, as you Catholics like to do, Taylor, any sacred spot, you build a big cathedral over top of it, and it becomes a place to visit, for time immemorial. And so when I went there to the Church of the Nativity, which is built over top of,
Marcus, I hate to interrupt you, and I hate to dispute you.
Yeah.
But the Church of the Nativity is in Bethlehem.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I'm thinking of.
I know the one you mean.
Yeah.
But you're using the wrong name. I'm trying to draw the name out of my head, and it's not coming. I know which one you're talking about. Go on.
Yeah, apologies. I called that the wrong thing. The church that's built over top of where they believe Jesus' home in Nazareth was.
Yes.
Which is not what I would have expected. It's a cave out of stone, which maybe lends to your argument, Taylor, that he was a stonemason. Anyway,
I should say, it is really easy to take that concept of a stonemason and turn it into something that it isn't. And I don't mean to imply anything in that regard. Enough said about that. So, as I said, there's these 4 traits. And the first one is, of course, his name, Jesus. All right. Well, where's this come from? Well, we all know that name comes from God, that's what he was told, you will name your son. Well, here's the thing. Again, you've got to know the Jewish culture to see this. If you've ever seen a map of the way the temple was laid out, there are multiple different courts that get progressively smaller. I think everyone knows of the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. And then where only the high priest was allowed to go, and then only once a year. And outside of that, of course, that's where the ark is. And then you have the holy place that's outside of that has the menorah, the shewbread table, those sorts of things. And then you come outside and you have the court where the sacrifices are given and the washing basin is. And of course, these are areas only the priests are allowed to go to. And then outside of that, you reach the men's court, which is where most of the rites for the people were performed. And the women's court is outside of that, quite some distance. And then there's the area where Gentiles were allowed, which is out on the very perimeter. Okay. So you notice this distance. Well, now that once you keep this geography in mind, what you realize is that on the day that Jesus is circumcised, which is the day he would have been officially named, the way that we do it, say, in some churches do it with where they baptize infants. Sometimes it's done other places, but generally done very early in the child's life, within a couple of days. The priest or whoever it is would have looks at the parents and says, "What name do you give your child?" Well, that's what would have happened there. But the catch is, Mary's not there. The priest is standing there with Joseph holding Jesus. Mary isn't standing in the women's court some distance away. That means it's Joseph that has to answer that question. What name do you give your son? Now, he knows who this is. He's been told who this is. He doesn't say. He couldn't have. If he'd have said, he'd have been hauled out of there's a maniac. But he gives the answer he was commanded to give. He was standing there all alone, and he did exactly what he was supposed to do. And what's not recorded, but what I'm absolutely willing to bet happened, is the exact same thing that's recorded with John the Baptist and Zechariah. Because remember, they asked Zechariah, same thing. You see that they're talking to him, even though he's mute. They're not talking to Elizabeth. They're talking to him. They say, "What name do you give your son?" And when he says John, what do they say? "There's no one in your family with that name. Are you sure?" And he says his name is John. And of course, we all know what happens. That's what happens here. I'm willing to bet you that when Joseph was asked, "What name do you give your son?" that the answer that he gave was Jesus. And they looked at him and said, "There is no one in your family with this name. Are you sure that's the name?" And he says, "Yes, his name is Jesus." I bet my next paycheck that happened, because that's what would have happened in that culture. Families carry names. This one is out of line. In the West, we don't think of that. Both of my girls have very unique names that have no connection to anyone in my family. Sometimes people do that for internal family political reasons. Sometimes we name people after their ancestors. But in the West, it happens either way. In the Jewish culture at that time, it absolutely did not. And it would absolutely have triggered a question, why? But what's important to see here is that Joseph does exactly what he's commanded to do. He doesn't blink. He doesn't back off. He does what he's supposed to do. And so that's the first trait in my mind. He gives him that name. And that's, of course, what sets him on the path.
That's amazing. I had never thought about the layout of the temple and what that implied for this particular situation that you just described. I think that's awesome. That's an amazing insight into this. By the way, it's the Church of the Annunciation. That's what I was looking for.
Thank you. You are correct. That's it.
And yep. And then another church built over top of his traditional, what they believed to be was Joseph's carpenter's shop, is the Church of St. Joseph.
Yes.
And I had the privilege of going to both of those places, and I was surprised to find basically caves in both places, not a structure, built. But anyway, yeah, this what you just described there of Joseph standing all alone in a place, tremendous pressure from the culture to give the wrong answer to a question. Courage, takes a lot of courage. Says a lot about the man. Wow. I never thought about the layout of the temple and what that would have implied here.
That's now a trend as far as his courage and his steadfastness and his obedience to God. He's already done that by supporting Mary after she got pregnant, and he wasn't the father, as he talked about. In that culture, that was very unseemly, but he stuck with her. He trusted what Mary told him about what the angel told Mary about who this child was and is, and then when it came to the naming, he was obedient again, obedient to God, going, I think, solely on what Mary told him, if I'm not mistaken, as far as what his name was to be,
Yes.
and without hesitation. So that's uh, incident number 2 of steadfastness and trustworthiness and supporting his wife, and most importantly, being obedient to God, which is just awesome. And again, completely not glossed over in the Bible, but not obvious about these things that you're drawing out. So very cool.
And sorry, one more thing to interject. The man that receives even less attention than Joseph is Joseph's father. Somebody
Yes.
raised Joseph to be the man.
Somebody had to set this up.
Exactly. And
You
we
know-
know, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So we know nothing about him other than his name from the genealogy. Just like we talked last episode, though, about Mary's mother. At least Mary and Joseph both had the benefit of knowing something that an angel had told them. But Mary's mother and Joseph's father, you know, they lived through the last days of the dark period, the period of silence, you know, the 400 years leading up to this event that would literally change history and divide time. So their faithfulness in that time of silence and darkness is extremely commendable.
You know, I've got a personal belief. I don't think this is grounded in anything theological. Although if you stop and think about it, it probably is. Everything happens for a reason. And honestly, I feel like a lot of us have we all have something we're here to do. And maybe that something is simply to provide a bridge to the next person who then has something to do. But, you talk about Joseph's parents, Joseph's father. Yes, he had, he probably has no idea what he is setting up. He's doing what he's supposed to do. And it would not be until it all comes to fruition many years later that the lights snap on. We don't know if Joseph's father was alive then or not. It's something that he's just simply the record does not say. So, but nonetheless, you're absolutely right, Marcus. His part in this is just as obvious as it is going back generation after generation after generation to set this line in place. So, and that's a good segue because that brings us to the next trait. So we have Jesus of Nazareth. Well, Nazareth isn't Jerusalem. Like, it's not even Bethlehem. It's Nazareth. And there are a couple of places in the Bible where, the subject of Nazareth pops up and somebody says, does anything good come from Nazareth? So, that there's some prejudice there. You can see it. But that's still the town that is considered to be his hometown. And I think it's important here to recognize that there are a couple of things that are going to pop up that you have to look at through the perspective of the speaker rather than the way we look at it. And this is one of them. The people in Jesus' day would have seen him as a citizen of the town of Nazareth. That's where he came from. And we also know the people in that town knew him. Now, it's not, when we use the word city, we unfortunately think of things the way we think of them, with, places with hundreds of thousands or millions of people. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what we would think of mostly as a small town. Okay. We're thinking of something along the lines of, my goodness, Cumberland, Maryland's probably bigger today than Nazareth was. It's not huge. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, either personally or through family or by reputation. It's a place you can't hide. That's the way all human communities were in those days. There were very few of what we think of as big cities. I mean, the oldest city in the world, Damascus, even in those days, was not big. So you sort of got to think about that from this perspective that this is a small town. And the result, of course, as we know, is when he shows up to preach, nobody accepts him because everybody, wait a minute, we know this guy. We watched him grow up. Where'd this come from? And that's perfectly understandable. I go home today and people still think of me as the teenager that I was. And it's almost inevitable that some of the screw ups and errors and dumb things I've done get trotted out. I plead guilty. Okay. That's the nature of the beast. I can still remember with my father, people would call and ask for Eddie. And you knew it was somebody that knew him growing up because he hadn't gone by that name in 40 years or more. But they call and ask for Eddie. You knew. So
Yep.
that's part of it is we got a small town where people know him. We also know this. He almost certainly would have been given a trade. It was absolutely unseemly in those days, in that Jewish culture, for an able-bodied male to not have a trade. He had to have one. And the most likely one was he would have been apprenticed to Joseph himself. That's usually the way trades worked. They were passed on from father to son. I mean, even today, how common is it to go into New York and into the areas where there's a large Jewish population, and you see the sign that says Steinwitz and Son? This is the way that culture worked. So it's very likely he would have been apprenticed to Joseph, likely as a stonemason. Interestingly enough, that same documentary I was telling you about, that was one of the things that the commentator said. He said, looking at these marks, you could tell which ones were made by the masters and which ones are made by the apprentices. He said there are differences between them. And he said, I often stand there and look at the apprentices' marks and say, I wonder, could this be his? Don't know. Again, we also know that Joseph would have educated him because we know that he would have taught him to read and write, because that's the only way things like that were taught. There was no such thing as a school. You didn't send kids off to school. You taught them yourself. So he would have taught Jesus to read and write. And we know that he could read and write because if you remember the story of the woman caught in adultery, what does he do? He bends down and he writes in the dust. I've often wondered what was written, but that's another discussion. We know that he could write, and we know he could read because remember, at the visit to the synagogue in Nazareth, he stood up to read and was given the book of Isaiah, and he reads it. Now, what's really interesting, and this is another side topic, what he says is not what's written in Isaiah, which means everyone in the entire room would have gone, wait a minute, that's not right. Because if there's one thing they knew, it was Isaiah. But that's another topic for discussion. But we know he could read, we know he could write. And that would have had to have come from Joseph, sitting there. And think about this. Joseph had a regular job. He was out hours and hours of the day. So he would have had to have taught Jesus this in his time off. So think about what that means. I don't know about you. When I get done work for the day, there's really not a lot that I want to do other than just try to rest because it's been long, it's been tiring, it's been stressful. But yet, here we go. We're going to do this. And he did.
I just want to point out that that there's a great scene in The Chosen. It's season 3, episode 3, titled "Physician, Heal Thyself," is where it depicts Jesus reading from the book of Isaiah in his hometown in the synagogue, and it's a really, really powerful scene and episode.
Jesus.
Thank you, Rabbi Benjamin. Peace. No, it's not easy to share in front of Nazareth's most preeminent rabbi, but I'll do my best. And I'm certain that if I miss a word or two, one of you at least will speak up, huh?
Oh, don't worry.
I wonder who it will be. A reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to the opening of the prison for those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The fulfillment of this scripture, as you have heard it, is today. This is the year of the Lord's favor. This is a year of Jubilee. Here, now.
We are with you. Keep going. Not bad for a carpenter's son, yes?
I mean, especially Joseph. May he rest in peace.
Jesus,
Yes, sir.
we've been hearing about the signs and wonders. And now this? Are you claiming to be more than a rabbi? More than even the baptizer?
No doubt one of you will quote me the proverb, "Physician, heal yourself." The things we heard you did in Capernaum and in Syria, do here in your hometown. Yes?
Why not?
I get it. It's always easier to accept hard truth and even greatness from strangers than from those you know well, especially those you knew as awkward teenagers or even as adults, as some of you saw earlier. But this brings up an important truth. No prophet is acceptable in his hometown.
Be careful with what you call yourself.
This should be easy to prove. Dinah and Rafi, you say you saw it, yes?
Yes. Yes, we saw it, but he did not claim this.
A true prophet from Adonai would not deny his own people's signs and wonders.
Listen carefully. When a great famine hit Israel during the days of Elijah, 3 years and 6 months, there were many widows, yes? And we know how the Father cares for his chosen people, especially widows. But Elijah was sent to none of them, not a one. Instead, he was sent to a widow in Sidon, in Zarephath, a Gentile woman. There were many lepers in Israel during this time, but none of them were cleansed, except Naaman. Only a Gentile, a Syrian soldier, an enemy of the Lord's people. If you cannot accept that you are spiritually poor and captive in the same way that a Gentile woman and a Syrian leper recognize their need, if you do not realize that you need a year of the Lord's favor, then I cannot save you.
Jesus bar Joseph. But as from the law of Moses, whose life and words you have spat upon today, your sentence is death.
Rabbi Benjamin, this isn't going to happen. Not today.
Talking about the size of the city or the town of Nazareth. I believe when I went there, the tour guide was describing what it would have been like in Jesus' time, and I think if I recall correctly, he said there might have been a couple dozen families, so extremely small, tight community. So you're absolutely right in the way that you framed that.
It wouldn't have been huge. It would have been very small. So moving on to the third trait, Jesus of Nazareth, king. Well, this one gets really interesting because you can look at this a bunch of different ways. But the way I like to do it is to focus on the concept of the house of David. Now, again, there is this lengthy description that makes it absolutely clear that Jesus was of the house of David because that's where Joseph was. And remember that that's where the story starts, is that they are going to Bethlehem to be enrolled. The census has been called, and so everyone has to return to their own house. Well, we know David was from Bethlehem, so this is where all of the house of David comes to Bethlehem. It's really interesting. One of the pieces that kind of gets glossed over here, we think of this through all the art and so forth. We think of this as two people showing up in a small town that nobody knows them. That's true, but think about this one. David had how many sons? And so you start doing the math on that, and we're how many years post? That's going to get really big. So it's not just two people that showed up in Bethlehem those days. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, which is, of course, why there's no room at the inn, because everybody's there. What does that also mean? That also means that Joseph is showing up with his family. These are people that he maybe doesn't know directly, but certainly there's going to be some sort of connection. There's going to be some that he's going to know, who will know some, who will know some, and who will know some. He's walking into a little bit of a storm because he has his obviously pregnant but not married to him yet wife. Boy, that's going to be some explanations that are going to have to be given. And he's going to have a good one. And again, if he gives the one that he knows is the truth, boy, that's going to be, they're going to be saying, this man's a Looney Tune. Oh, I've always sort of wondered how that went down, but we don't have anything that tells us that. I can't begin to come up with a grasp on what that would look like. But I think it's more important to look at it from this perspective. We know the promise that was made by God to David, that his house would reign forever. David, I am sure, saw that the same way that any human being would see. He would have seen it that my kingdom, my throne, will be from here till the end. And that my sons and their sons, proving once again that God's way is not our way. There's a joke that gets made about this every now and again of, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. I'm a firm believer that the good Lord has a sense of humor, and that sometimes his reaction to the way we interpret things is, what's this? I think it happens. Can't prove it, but I suspect it does. There's too many things that make you chuckle.
I just had an epiphany.
Yeah.
I just had an epiphany as you're saying this, because, as Christians, we've heard what you're saying many, many times, but as you're saying it this time, for some reason, something hit me. When God told David that his lineage would live, his kingdom would live forever or go on forever. As you pointed out, in David's mind, oh, okay, then, I'm going to have a successor and a successor and a successor, and it's going to go on, like in the traditional way. And if it had gone that way, and here we are today, and there's a king, that's a human king, that's a descendant of David, then it would still be a fulfillment of that prophecy, but in a traditional sense. The problem or the difference is that you could make the case that it was just a coincidence. It was still human effort that allowed that to happen. And yeah, maybe in the Old Testament, God might have supposedly said that, but whatever, it's a coincidence. But when God fulfills the prophecy in a completely unexpected way, that proves God's sovereignty and hand in it, because no human could have thought of fulfilling the prophecy in the way that it was. So that's a really, I don't know, it's just an epiphany I just had as you were saying this.
No, you're absolutely correct. And frankly, in that concept, it would have provided a competitor. We can't have that. And the other thing I think that's important to remember there is that think about what that promise also entails. It would mean that the behavior of the successors would be irrelevant. And if there's one thing that you can tell from the Old Testament, don't bother getting to the New, just take a look at the Old Testament. You can see that that's one thing that God doesn't put up with, is misbehavior. If you continue to misbehave, eventually you're going to pay the price. Well, this promise would seem to cut the legs out from underneath of that. And, God is not mocked. And so there's just no way that's going to happen. It's going to have to be some other way where this promise can be fulfilled, but wherein people still have to do what they're supposed to do. And so that's what happens. So, we obviously don't have any DNA to test. But, the belief and the understanding is that if you match Joseph's to Jesus's, they're not going to match. Okay, fine. Take that as given. And, I think it's important to remember here too, probably should have said this earlier, that Jesus was a real human being. This isn't someone who looks like a human being and acts like a human being, but really isn't. Oh no, he's absolutely one of us. He couldn't have done what he did if he wasn't just like us, built out of the exact same stuff. Okay. Spiritual component is different, but the physical component is identical. So while Jesus isn't technically a blood member, although in those days there's no way to test that, by Jewish law, he is the son of Joseph. That means that he is a member of the house of David. Period. There's no way to break that. So the line is there. And thus, when he takes his place at the end as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Christ the King, the promise has been fulfilled. And we know that that house now reigns forever. So he's done exactly what he promised, just not in the way that anybody expected. But that should be the norm, not the exception, frankly.
Maybe I'm weird. Well, I think that's indisputable.
We could take this as gives. Moving on.
But you mentioned DNA, how they didn't have it. You can't prove bloodline in that way. But again, I've often wondered if what was Jesus's DNA? What did it look like, since he didn't have an earthly father? Just curious. Even though he wasn't, as you said, by blood from Joseph, he was still of the house of David because he was Joseph's son. But if I recall correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary's lineage traces back to David as well, if I recall. And so he was literally from the house of David on both his mother's side and his earthly father's side, as well as the line that leads all the way back to Adam, whose father was God, as you pointed out.
Yes.
One of the things that is just super cool about prophecy in the Bible in general, and we have the luxury of hindsight and having the whole story that we can look at, and you can see how things ended. But prophecies being fulfilled in the most unlikely places and with the most unlikely people, with timing that no one else would have or could have thought of, much less arranged. We talked about this a little bit last week, describing this as the greatest story ever told. And of course, all of the Jews had been looking forward to the Messiah for hundreds and hundreds of years. Micah had predicted the birth of the Messiah, I think it was 700 years before, and predicted that he would be born in Bethlehem. And so even though Joseph was of the house and lineage of David from Bethlehem, I've often wondered, why was he living in Nazareth? What made him move there to begin with? I don't know if he went there for work, or I don't know. As we've already said, that Nazareth was not much of a place and not very reputable. So I don't know what reason he would have had to go there. But anyway, that's where he lives. And then he is engaged to a woman who also lives there. So even if they knew the timing was about right for Micah's prophecy to come true, they wouldn't have expected it to be them, and neither would anybody else's, because one, they're not even in the right town. And only God could have orchestrated events in such a way to take two people in the wrong place and bring them to the right place at the right time to fulfill a prophecy in the most perfect way possible. It's just amazing.
You know, Marcus, you mentioned the line, and it brings me to something else. I'm a firm believer that there is no person whatsoever, none, that does not have at least one redeeming quality. That there is no such thing as someone who is irredeemable, who's gone beyond the pale. Now, again, I'm not going to drill into that too far here, but I want to point this out. Take a good hard look at that line. Look what's in it. There's a murderer, several murderers actually. There's an adulterer, there's a prostitute, there's all kinds of unsavory things in there. But God has an frankly annoying habit sometimes of taking very flawed people and accomplishing amazing things. So that, and I think that line shows you're dealing with human beings. You're dealing with people who make mistakes, who do all kinds of things they shouldn't. Good Lord knows I do. And yet, look what they accomplish. Look what God accomplishes with them. So
His purposes cannot be thwarted accidentally or on purpose. He's going to do what he set out to do, and he's going to use whatever material is available. And oftentimes, as you just pointed out, in Jesus's earthly family, and we talked about this last week as well, these are some very sordid characters in his family tree. They're the kind of relatives you hope don't come for Christmas, right?
True enough.
But God worked through all of those flaws and failings and shortcomings to ultimately bring about the Messiah's birth. And it's encouraging. The story of redemption that shines through just in Jesus's earthly bloodline should encourage people everywhere. Family,
I was just gonna
know
say,
you if you messed up. Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say that's one of God's title, many names, is Redeemer, the great Redeemer, and that's a great example of just in the structure. You see, even in the, like you said, Taylor, just the lineage and all the sin and flaws of the people in that lineage. So I looked it up. So the Gospel of Matthew, right off the beginning, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, his legal father, back to David through Solomon, and then all the way back to Abraham. And then the Gospel of Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38, is widely interpreted by many Christian scholars and traditions as being traced in the lineage through Mary, his biological mother, back to David through Nathan, and ultimately to Adam.
So you've got that connection there. So that brings us to the last trait. And honestly, this is the one I find the most fascinating, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. We know that Jesus was a Jew and a devout one. And that, again, that comes from Joseph. He would have been the only one that could have taught him this. Again, this is not in that custom. This is the father's responsibility. The mother would have had next to nothing to do with this. Remember, even today, you go to an Orthodox synagogue, and you will discover the men and women don't sit together. Okay? They sit in two different places. So this would have been Joseph's responsibility to teach this. And to me, the moment that I think shows this the best is the trip to the temple, when the story we all know of, that they go to Jerusalem, they journey to Jerusalem, they come back, and when they stop camp the first night coming back, they discover Jesus isn't there. And they go back and they find him in the temple. That story to me carries an enormous amount of evidence. So what happens? Well, remember that when they get that there's a number of pieces that are happening here. The first one is the travel to. They get to Jerusalem and they're doing something. Now, what the something is, we don't know. It doesn't specifically say. I'm going to crawl out on a little bit of a limb here because I think it explains the practical aspect. And that is the fact that, look, all three of us are parents. And we all know that when you're outside the house, you have a laser focus on where your kids are. Okay? They're right there. We may all be carrying on. We may be at a park or at a picnic or whatever. But I can tell you that, my daughter is 300 yards that direction. I could turn and see her. She's right there. Okay? It's my job to do that. In the West, we think of that as both parents' responsibility. Not in this culture. In this culture, it depends on their age. On the South, if Christ is still a child, it would have been Mary's responsibility to keep track of him, make sure he was okay. If he has become legally an adult, it's now Joseph's. He's one of the men. Joseph would be taking care of him. Well, to me, that explains how Jesus gets lost. In my understanding of what happens here, my belief is this is the trip to the temple where Jesus goes through. Today we call it bar mitzvah, and I apologize, I don't know if that was the term in those days or not. But the process, the ritual of going from being a child to being a man. He would have done that at the temple, which explains why they're going. All right, so you put these pieces together. That means that on this trip south from Nazareth to Jerusalem, he would have been traveling with the women. The men would have been off in one group. The women would have been in a different group with the children. There he is. He's doing what he's supposed to do. They get to Jerusalem. They go through this process. They start home. He should be traveling with the men at this point. Joseph looks around, doesn't see him, thinks, he's forgotten he's supposed to be with us now. When we stop tonight, I will take him aside and remind him. Mary, of course, looks around, doesn't see him, and says, he's with his father where he belongs. Of course, there's no such thing as cell phones. There's no way to send a text and say, hey, do you got Jesus? It's not till they get to camp and they start to set up camp. And Mary looks at Joseph and says, where's Jesus? And Joseph says, well, he's with you, isn't he? And things go, oh, we got a problem. Okay. I'm reasonably certain, as certain as I can be, that that's the likely scenario here. So when you look at that, now you get into this situation of, okay, we got to go back and find him. So they head back to Jerusalem. They search, and where do they find him? In the temple. And he is sitting with the elders of the law, discussing the law. Now, everybody looks at this moment as a miracle. Everybody looks at this as Jesus' spiritual self is in control. He knows all of this stuff, and therefore he's able to carry on with them just like he would some years later. Not in my opinion. In my opinion, this is not a miracle at all. This is Joseph. Joseph has taught Jesus the scriptures to the point where he can quote chapter and verse with the best of them. And again, he's a devout Jew. Joseph is. He would have taught Jesus the scriptures from the earliest of age. And by the time that we get to this moment, he knows it. Now, how well does he know it? Enough to impress the elders of the law. But let's stop and think about that for a second. How many times have we had, either when we were children or with our children, where they run into somebody who is much more senior, much more educated, but still is very impressed with what this child knows for their age? My daughter's like that with the space program. I've watched her carry on a conversation with an astronaut where the astronaut just sort of stood there flat-footed that he couldn't believe that this kid knew all of this stuff. Does she know the level he does? Absolutely not. But she knows enough that it impresses him. Is that what happened here? Possibly. Is it possible that he really could keep up to their level? That's possible too. Don't know. But there's enough here that this is what you're seeing. You're seeing Joseph. Joseph has taught him those scriptures. Can't say this for sure. There's no way to know. Odds are pretty high Mary couldn't read. Most women didn't in those days. It would have had to have been Joseph. He taught him these scriptures. And more importantly, he teaches him to be a Jew. He teaches him that these are the customs which we must follow. These are the obligations you have. You will note that several times in the scriptures we talk about that he goes to the temple to do as was customary. There's another point where there's tax that he is supposed to pay, the temple tax, and he pays it in a somewhat unique way, but it's there. Again and again, we see this compliance with Jewish law, which brings me to my personal favorite, and that is the wedding at Cana. The wedding at Cana has some really interesting angles to it. The first one is Jesus is not yet in his ministry, but he's an adult. So early 20s maybe? Somewhere in there. Enough where he's not living under his parents' roof, or at least not under their control anymore. We don't even know if Joseph is there. Joseph's last mention is before this. We know Mary is there. Now, what else do we know? We know that Jesus finds out they've run out, or Mary finds out they've run out of wine. That tells me this would have been a huge embarrassment if this was just publicly said. That tells me that this is a family member's wedding. This is somebody that Mary is connected to, or the family is connected to. So whose wedding is it? We don't know. But my strong inclination is this is a family member. All right. So this is somebody who, that's how Mary finds out, because either the groom or somebody tells her. It wouldn't have been the groom. It would have had to have been the mother or possibly the bride tells her, we're out of wine. And this is embarrassing. What does Mary do? She realizes she can't embarrass the family. She knows she has somebody right over there that can solve this problem. Now, it's going to involve bending some rules, but it's going to have to be done. And so what she do? She goes and she tracks him down, pulls him aside and says, "Oh, why?" The explanation, the response that Jesus gives is, "Why is that my problem?" Now, it's said a little nicer than that. I wonder if that's the scribe being nice or what, but it doesn't matter. The answer is, why is this my problem? Very typical young man's answer. I will freely admit I have given some version of that myself on a number of occasions. The Bible does not record what happens next. It just says that the next thing it says is Mary telling the servants, do whatever he tells you. There's a piece missing in here. I am reasonably certain that it went something along these lines. You are my son, and you will do as I say. I'd be willing to bet that one. And so, but what's Jesus' reply? Whether that gets said or whether he just does it doesn't really matter. He says, yes, mother.
Real quick. Or she gives him a look. She just gives her
that'll do it too.
Just gives the look.
But
doesn't have to say anything.
In any case, the answer is yes, mother. And he goes and does what needs to be done. And, is he maybe bending a rule here? Maybe. But I don't think it matters. What it matters is that as a devout Jew, he would have respected his mother. Honor your father and mother. The first commandment with a promise. And so he does exactly what she tells him to do and makes things happen. To me, that is a very powerful statement that Joseph has drilled this concept of what it means to be a Jew into his head. And I'll finish with this. At times throughout the New Testament in the Gospels, we see someone is concerned that the law of Moses is being taken away. And Christ promises not a single piece will be taken away until all has been fulfilled. Now, what they don't realize is that moment is like right in front of us. It's like coming in the next few days, but that's still the promise. And so he's doing exactly what he's expected to do as a Jew. Now, you can drill into that a lot further, which I'm not going to do so here, but there's tons of things that being a Jew means that if you really stop and think about it, either we know he did, we can assume he did, or that we can say there should be an explanation why he didn't. So that's my thoughts.
It's awesome. I mean, delivered well as well, by the way, as in characteristic Taylor George style. You're a great storyteller, great orator.
I'm a historian.
Yeah, you're a historian. You're a legal, giving your case in front of courts and that kind of stuff. So very, comprehensive, very thorough. Man, I don't know what else to add other than what we've already added throughout. I guess I'll say this, that one of the big reasons I wanted you to give this summary on the podcast is because not just because it's Joseph that is often overlooked in this story, and you pulled a lot of details out that are overlooked, but because one of the kind of the sub themes of this podcast is trying to equip men, young men and older men on how to be better men. And not that any of us are perfect men by any stretch of the imagination. We're trying to become, good men every single day. And one of the things that we tell ourselves on this podcast behind the scenes is, we call it fire for effect, because we want the conversations that we have together and the conversations that we have had together to be kind of a purifying fire, to help us, little by little become better children of God and better men to our families, and to our communities. And as you laid out the thread and the subtle things that were kind of that are heavily implied or must be the case, but not specifically stated in the Bible, that reveals Joseph's character. Wow. I mean, you just can't. It makes even more sense why God chose him, which is another point too. It's not just like happenstance that Joseph happened to be the husband of Mary. God, again, he orchestrates every detail. So he purposely chose Joseph as well as choosing Mary, to shepherd Jesus into this world as a child. And boy, what a phenomenal example. And because there's not a lot of detail about Joseph, it's probably because he was a very stoic, just matter of fact, just get the job done kind of guy, which are qualities that are good qualities for men to have. Not a lot of emotion, just put your head down, get the job done, work hard to provide for the family, work hard to be honorable for the family, and for your name. And as you pointed out, very, very likely was a heavy influence on Jesus' character, as well as Jesus' education and his ability to read, his ability to likely have to, be good with math, as you pointed out, with being an artisan, trying to construct things. You have to know math, obviously, well, geometry, that kind of stuff. But yeah, his character comes out. You bring his character out very well, I think, in the way you tell the story. And it is, when you think about Jesus' character too, how Jesus says a lot more in the Bible, obviously, than Joseph does. But Jesus' character seems very consistent with Joseph's character as far as personality, and obviously steadfastness, and of course, Jesus' biological father, so to speak, I guess, is God himself. So that part of his character clearly comes out as well, but it's not inconsistent with how Joseph was as a father. So anyway, I'm just so pleased that you were able to give this talk and explanation of Joseph's character and how it influenced Jesus and how it's an example for us to follow. I'll just leave it with that.
Couldn't agree more. Joseph is the example of a good man, a good husband, and a good father that I think most of us didn't realize has been looking at us all this time. From just these few passages of scripture that we have, we can derive so much information about this man. And as you were talking, I was kind of making mental notes of these characteristics that Joseph had that every one of us as husbands and fathers and just men in general should emulate. First of all, he was a good leader of his family. He was obedient. He was obedient to God. He was courageous. He was committed. He was a man of conviction. He had compassion. He was creative. That was his job, to be a creator. And he was competent. All of these things are the attributes that men should aspire to. Can't think of a better example to highlight and put forward to people, especially at this time of year, than Joseph, a man that we know so little about, but have so much to learn from. Thanks for presenting that, Taylor. That was awesome.
Thank you. I have often, as a father myself, looked at Joseph and thought, yeah, this is the example to emulate, and this is where you take your inspiration. So I'm a firm believer that the men and women that we encounter in the Bible are useful in many respects, all of them, the good and the bad both. But Joseph especially, I have often found a great many things that are useful there. So I'm glad to be able to pass this on. Gentlemen, it's been a lot of fun. I have appreciated our time together. Unfortunately, I'd say it has come to its end again. So if I don't see you beforehand, please have a Merry Christmas. And
Absolutely.
for all of you who are out there in the internet land, we hope to see you again soon. And until then, you also have a Merry Christmas.
Amen. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you guys. God bless. Thanks again. It's good to see you all.